Sometimes the most important voice in the room is the one nobody wants to hear. Sometimes a child sees what grown folks choose to ignore. In 1911, Oklahoma, 12-year-old Ora May lived in a world that dismissed her observations before she could finish speaking them. But when the wealthy rancher's daughter started acting strange, sleepwalking toward the old fields, muttering about voices underground, Ora noticed what the adults wouldn't acknowledge. While they explained away the girl's behavior, Ora followed, her instincts to a forgotten well filled with deadly gas. Her discovery saved a life that day, but it would take 50 years before anyone asked her to tell the story. What happens when the person everyone overlooks turns out to be the one who sees everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The documentary camera sits steady on its tripod, its lens focused on Ora May, Washington, as she settles into the worn leather chair on her front porch. At 62, her hands carry the evidence of decades of honest work, farming, cleaning, raising children, but her eyes hold something deeper. They carry the weight of a story that has waited half a century to be told. "You sure you want to hear this?" she asks the young filmmaker, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who has learned that words matter. Folks didn't much want to listen back then. The camera captures her slight smile as she smooths her church dress, the same navy blue she's worn to important occasions for 15 years. Behind her, the Oklahoma prairie stretches toward a horizon that seems to swallow the world whole. "I reckon it started when I was 12, she begins, her voice settling into the rhythm of remembrance. 1911 it was. Different world then. Different rules. The year 1911 carried the weight of a new century still finding its legs. In Creek County, Oklahoma, the oil boom had brought wealth to some and left others exactly where they'd always been, working other people's land, hoping for rain, praying for mercy. The town of Bristow had grown from a farming settlement into something resembling civilization, with a proper main street, a bank that stayed busy, and enough people to fill the pews of 3 different churches every Sunday. But civilization, Ora learned early, was a word that meant different things to different folks. The Washington family sharecropped 40 acres on the outskirts of town, land that belonged to the Hendricks family but might as well have belonged to the bank for all the say they had in its use. Ora's father, Moses Washington, was a man who measured his words as carefully as he measured seed corn. He had fought in the Indian Wars as a buffalo soldier, earned his stripes and his scars, and came home to Oklahoma Territory when it was still wild enough that a black man with steady hands and a clear eye could make something of himself. "Papa never talked much about the war," Ora tells the camera, her fingers working an invisible pattern on her dress. "But he taught me to see things, really see them," said a soldier who couldn't read sign, wouldn't live long enough to regret it. Ora's mother, Constance, had been born free in Kansas, daughter of a preacher who believed education was the Lord's work and ignorance was the devil's playground. She could read better than half the white folks in town, could cipher numbers that made grown men scratch their heads, and could deliver a baby or set a bone with hands that moved like prayer. But in 1911 Oklahoma, what mattered wasn't what you knew, it was what others were willing to let you know. The Washington house sat small and proud, on a rise overlooking the creek, built with Moses's own hands from lumber he'd earned working extra days for the mill. 2 rooms and a kitchen lean-to, with a garden that Constance tended like scripture, and a chicken coop that Moses had built tight enough to keep out everything except determination and prayer. Ora was the middle child of 5, old enough to understand the world's hard edges, but young enough to believe they might be changed. Her brothers worked the fields with their father. Her sisters helped their mother with the endless work that kept a family fed and clothed. But Ora was the one who wandered. "Mama used to worry I'd wander right into trouble," Ora chuckles, the sound carrying decades of affection. "Said I had eyes bigger than good sense." She wandered down to the creek, where the water ran shallow. over smooth stones, where she could watch the play of light and shadow and wonder at the way minnows moved like thoughts darting through clear water. She wandered to the edge of the wheat fields where meadowlarks built their nests in the grass, and where she first learned that the world held secrets if you knew how to look for them. And sometimes, when her chores were done and her lessons finished, she wandered toward town. Bristow in 1911 was a place of sharp divisions, drawn in unspoken lines. Main Street belonged to everyone, technically, but everyone knew which side of the street was theirs and which wasn't. The bank and the general store faced each other across a wide dirt road that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. The hotel sat at one end like a dowager empress presiding over her domain, while the train depot anchored the other end with its promise of places beyond the horizon. On the north side of town, past the last respectable house and down a road that the city fathers had never gotten around to improving, stood the collection of homes and businesses that served the colored community. The church was the finest building among them, painted white and maintained with a fierce pride that spoke to the congregation's understanding that their house of worship reflected not just on them, but on their Lord. The school was smaller, newer, and always in need of something: books, supplies, repairs that the county promised to get around to eventually. But it was the south side of town that drew Ora's curious eyes, where the houses grew larger and the yards more manicured as you moved away from the commercial district. It was there, on a rise that commanded a view of the entire valley, that the McAllister Ranch spread across the landscape like a declaration of ownership. Silas McAllister had come to Oklahoma Territory in the 1890s, with a stake and a dream that had grown into the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. His ranch house was a 2-story monument to success, painted white and wrapped, with porches that caught the morning sun and the evening breeze. Barns and outbuildings spread in all directions, each one maintained with a precision that spoke of resources and planning and the kind of confidence that comes with never having to ask permission. McAllister himself was a figure who commanded respect through presence alone. Tall and weathered, with grey threading through hair the colour of prairie grass, he carried himself with the upright bearing of a man who had earned his place through work and held it through will. He'd married well. Sarah Elizabeth Thornton had brought both refinement and connection to their union, along with the kind of education that showed in her speech and her carriage and the way she managed their household with quiet efficiency. Their daughter Lucy was 8 years old in 1911, a child who lived in the protected space that money and position could create. She had her own pony, her own governess, and her own bedroom with wallpaper that had come all the way from Chicago. She was a pretty child, with her mother's delicate features and her father's determined chin, and she moved through the world with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never been told she didn't belong. Ora first saw Lucy at the general store on a Saturday afternoon in early summer. The McAllister family had come to town for supplies, and Lucy had wandered over to examine the penny candy while her parents conducted their business with the proprietor. Ora stood outside on the boardwalk, pressed against the window with her face cupped in her hands, watching the interaction inside with the fascination of someone observing a different species. "You want something in there?" The voice belonged to Tom Edwards, the store owner's son, a boy about Ora's age who had inherited his father's sharp tongue and sharper temper. "Just looking," Ora replied, not moving from her position at the window. "Well, look somewhere else. You're making the customers nervous." Ora turned to study Tom's face, reading the mixture of authority and uncertainty that came from being granted power you haven't yet grown into. She could have argued. She had as much right to stand on the boardwalk as anyone. She could have walked away. It would have been easier, safer. Instead, she did what she always did. She looked deeper. "That little girl in there," she said, nodding toward Lucy, "she don't look right." Tom glanced through the window where Lucy stood perfectly still, staring at the candy counter with an intensity that seemed excessive for peppermint sticks and horehound drops. "She looks fine to me," he said, but his voice carried less conviction than his words. "Look at her hands," Ora insisted. "They're shaking." Tom looked again, and this time he saw what Ora had noticed immediately. Lucy's small hands trembled as she reached for the candy. A tremor so slight it might have been excitement, but somehow felt like something else entirely. "Probably just excited about candy," Tom said, but he kept watching. "Maybe," Ora agreed, though her tone suggested she thought otherwise. That was Ora's gift and her burden. She saw what others missed or chose not to see. It came from her father's training in reading the landscape for signs of trouble, from her mother's teaching about watching people's true selves emerge in unguarded moments. But mostly, it came from being someone who lived on the edges, who had learned early that survival sometimes depended on noticing things that others could afford to ignore. The summer of 1911 unfolded with the lazy rhythm of rural life. Crops grew, children played, and the adult world continued its complicated dance of commerce and social positioning. Ora helped with the family's work, attended school when it was in session, and tried to satisfy her curiosity without wandering into too much trouble. But she kept noticing Lucy McAllister. She saw her in town again 2 weeks later, walking with her governess along Main Street. The woman, Miss Pemberton, was a thin, nervous creature who had come from back east with credentials and expectations that Oklahoma was steadily wearing down to resignation. She kept one hand firmly on Lucy's shoulder as they walked, but Ora could see that the child's attention was elsewhere, fixed on something beyond the immediate surroundings. "She's listening to something," Ora murmured to herself, watching from across the street. Lucy's head was cocked slightly to one side, her expression one of intense concentration. She stumbled once, then again, as if her feet couldn't quite keep pace with wherever her mind had wandered. Ora followed at a distance, curious to see where this mysterious attention was leading. Miss Pemberton guided Lucy toward the millinery shop, where they disappeared inside to examine the latest fashions from Oklahoma City. But through the window, Ora could see that Lucy's focus remained elsewhere, her small face turned toward the back wall of the store, as if she could see through it to something beyond. That evening at dinner, Ora mentioned what she'd seen to her family. The response was swift and predictable. "Ora May, Washington," her mother said, setting down her fork with the kind of precision that indicated serious conversation was about to commence. "What did I tell you about watching white folks' business?" "I wasn't watching their business, Mama. You were just being curious where curious don't belong," her father interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "That's a luxury colored folks can't afford," Ora's older brother Samuel nodded in agreement. At 15, he already carried himself with the careful deference that would keep him safe, but would also, Ora feared, make him small. Little girl, probably. "Just had too much sugar," he offered. "Rich folks feed their children too much sweet stuff, makes them act peculiar." But Ora's mother was studying her daughter's face with the attention she usually reserved for reading scripture or watching storm. "Clouds build on the horizon. What exactly did you see?" she asked quietly. Ora described Lucy's strange focus, the way she seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. The stumbling that seemed to come from distraction rather than clumsiness. "Could be any number of things," Constance said finally. "Could be nothing at all." But that night, after the dishes were washed and the evening prayers said, Constance Washington sat on the porch in the gathering darkness and wondered what her middle daughter had seen in the McAllister girl that nobody else seemed to notice. She had learned, in her 43 years, that children sometimes saw things that adults had trained themselves to overlook. And she had learned that dismissing such observations too quickly could be a mistake that followed you for the rest of your life. The Oklahoma night settled around the Washington house with its familiar sounds. Cattle lowing in distant pastures, the creek murmuring its way toward the Arkansas River, the vast silence that came with living under a sky that stretched from horizon to horizon without obstruction. In her small bed, Ora lay awake thinking about Lucy McAllister and the way fear had looked wearing the face of an 8-year-old girl who had everything and seemed to be losing something she couldn't name. Tomorrow, Ora decided, she would pay closer attention. She would watch and listen and see what others missed. It was what her father had taught her, what her instincts demanded, and what the growing unease in her chest told her might be more important than anyone yet realized. The pressed wildflower lay between the pages of Ora's arithmetic book, as flat and delicate as a whisper. She had found it that morning, along the path where Lucy McAllister walked with her governess, crushed underfoot but still recognizable as Indian paintbrush, a flower that didn't typically grow in that particular spot. It was the kind of small detail that most folks would overlook, but Ora had learned from her mother to preserve such moments, pressing flowers and leaves between book pages like evidence of seasons passing. This flower, though, felt different. It felt like a clue. 3 weeks had passed since Ora first noticed Lucy's strange behavior in the general store, and what had seemed like an isolated incident was beginning to look like a pattern. Every few days brought a new observation that didn't quite fit with normal childhood behavior, small details that accumulated like storm clouds on a distant horizon. Miss Pemberton had mentioned to Mrs. Hendricks at the post office that Lucy had been having difficulty with her sleep schedule. The governess spoke in the careful, measured tones of someone trying to present a problem without actually calling it a problem. But Ora caught the worry underneath the polite words. "Sleepwalking," Miss Pemberton had said, adjusting her glasses. With nervous fingers, the child gets up in the middle of the night and tries to go outside. When I wake her, she doesn't remember anything about it. Mrs. Hendricks, who had raised 6 children of her own and considered herself an expert on childhood peculiarities, had offered the expected reassurance. "Oh, children do the strangest things. My youngest used to get up and rearrange all the kitchen chairs in the middle of the night. She outgrew it eventually." But Ora noticed that Miss Pemberton didn't look reassured. The woman's thin face carried the kind of worry that came from watching something she didn't understand and couldn't control. That evening, Ora shared this overheard conversation with her family during supper. The response was predictably cautious. "Not, or concern," her father said firmly, cutting into his cornbread with the precision he brought to all his work. "White folks' family problems are white folks' business." "But what if it's not a family problem?" Ora persisted. "What if there's something else causing it?" Her mother looked up from her plate, studying her daughter's face with the attention she gave to reading the signs of approaching weather. "What do you mean by something else?" Ora struggled to put her intuition into words. "I keep seeing her around town, and she always seems to be looking toward the same place, like she's hearing something or seeing something that pulls at her." "Where?" her mother asked quietly. "Toward the old fields. The ones past the McAllister property, where they used to do some mining before the ranch got established." Moses Washington set down his fork and looked directly at his daughter. "What do you know about those old fields?" "Not much," Ora admitted. "Just that Papa Jeremiah mentioned them once when I was asking about the different kinds of rock in the creek. Said there used to be some kind of digging out there, but it didn't amount to much and got abandoned." Samuel, her older brother, snorted dismissively. "Papa Jeremiah's older than dirt, and half his stories are made up. Probably wasn't any mining worth mentioning." But their father didn't dismiss the reference so quickly. Moses had lived in Oklahoma, territory long enough to know that the land held secrets, and that some of those secrets could be dangerous if disturbed or forgotten. "Those old operations," he said slowly, "sometimes they left things behind. Sometimes those things are best left alone." Before Ora could ask what he meant, her younger sister announced that she'd finished her mathematics homework and needed help with penmanship. The conversation moved on to safer territory, but Ora filed away her father's words along with all her other growing concerns about Lucy McAllister. The next afternoon brought the incident that transformed Ora's vague worries into something approaching. Alarm! She was returning from the creek with a bucket of water for her mother's washing when she saw a small figure in a white nightgown wandering through the tall grass at the edge of the old fields. The sun was still well above the horizon, making the sight even more unsettling than it would have been in darkness. Lucy McAllister was sleepwalking in broad daylight. Ora set down her bucket and crept closer, moving as quietly as her father had taught her when tracking game or avoiding trouble. Lucy moved with the strange, purposeful gait of someone following a path only she could see, her bare feet picking their way through grass and scattered stones with uncanny precision. As Ora watched, Lucy stopped and tilted her head to one side, exactly as she had done that day outside the millinery shop. She stood motionless for several heartbeats, then began to move again, angling toward a section of the field where the grass grew sparse and yellowed. "The singing well," Lucy murmured, her voice carrying clearly across the still afternoon air. "It's singing again." The words sent a chill down Ora's spine. She crept closer, staying low and using the scattered mesquite bushes for cover. Lucy had stopped again, this time kneeling in a patch of ground where nothing seemed to grow. Her small hands moved over the earth as if she were reading something written in the soil itself. "Voices underground," Lucy whispered, her eyes still closed, calling and calling. Ora was close enough now to see Lucy's face clearly. The child's expression was one of intense concentration, mixed with something that looked disturbingly like fear. Her nightgown was stained with grass and dirt, her dark hair tangled with burrs and bits of prairie debris. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the spell. Silas McAllister rode across the field at a gallop, his face dark with a mixture of fear and anger that spoke to how many times this scene had already played out. "Lucy Elizabeth," he called sharply. "Wake up, child." Lucy's eyes snapped open, and for a moment she looked completely lost, staring around at the field as if she had no idea how she'd gotten there. Then she saw her father bearing down on her, and tears began to stream down her dirt-stained cheeks. "Papa, I'm sorry," she sobbed, as he swung down from his horse and scooped her up. "I don't know how I got here. I was in my room, and then—" "It's all right, sweetheart," Silas said, but his voice carried a strain that suggested this was far from all right. "We're going to figure this out." Ora watched from her hiding place as father and daughter rode back toward the ranch house, Lucy clinging to Silas like a child, awakening from a nightmare to find that the real world offered little more comfort than her dreams. That evening, Ora carefully pressed the wildflower she had found into her arithmetic book, along with a sketch of exactly where Lucy had been kneeling in the field. She didn't yet know what these details meant, but she had learned from her parents that evidence was something you collected first and understood later. The next morning brought another disturbing incident. Ora was walking to school when she encountered. Dr. Morrison's buggy stopped outside the McAllister ranch house. The doctor emerged from the house, shaking his head, his expression troubled. "Nothing physically wrong with her that I can determine," he told Silas McAllister, his voice carrying, to where Ora crouched behind the ranch's front gate. "Her pulse is strong, her breathing clear, but these episodes you describe, they're getting worse," Silas interrupted. "More frequent, and she's going farther from the house each time." "Has she mentioned what she's looking for?" "Children sometimes have reasons for their behavior that make sense to them, even if those reasons seem strange to adults." Silas hesitated, then spoke in a lower voice that Ora had to strain to hear. "She talks about voices, says there's singing, coming from underground, and she needs to find where it's coming from." Dr. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. McAllister, I've seen cases like this before. Sometimes when children are under stress or experiencing changes in their environment, they can develop what we call fugue states. The sleepwalking, the fixation on particular locations. These can be symptoms of nervous exhaustion." "What kind of stress?" Silas asked. "Lucy has everything a child could want." "Sometimes having everything can be its own kind of pressure," the doctor replied diplomatically. Or there might be something in her environment that's affecting her, without anyone realizing it. Has there been any construction on your property recently? Any changes to the land around your home? Nothing significant. We've been meaning to clear some of the old brush from the back fields, but we haven't gotten around to it yet. What about the wells on your property? Are they all properly maintained and sealed? Of course, Silas said, but something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely certain. Although there are some old sites from before we bought the land, previous owner mentioned there had been some exploratory mining in the 80s, but nothing came of it. Dr. Morrison's expression sharpened. Mining? What kind of mining? Looking for coal, I think. Maybe some metals. Like I said, nothing came of it, and the sites were supposedly filled in years ago. Supposedly? Silas shifted uncomfortably. Well, I've never actually inspected them personally. They're out in the back fields where we don't run cattle. No reason to go poking around. Mr. McAllister, Dr. Morrison said carefully, I think it might be worth your while to take a look at those old sites. Sometimes abandoned mining operations can leave behind conditions that affect the surrounding area in unexpected ways. From her hiding place behind the gate, Ora felt a surge of vindication mixed with growing alarm. Dr. Morrison was suggesting exactly what she had been trying to tell her family, that Lucy's behavior might be connected to something in the environment, rather than something wrong with Lucy herself. But as she watched Silas McAllister nod politely and shake the doctor's hand, she could see that he wasn't taking the suggestion seriously. Rich men, Ora was learning, often heard advice differently than they heard instructions, and this sounded too much like advice. As Dr. Morrison drove away and Silas returned to his house, Ora remained crouched behind the gate, thinking about pressed flowers and underground voices and the way adults could look directly at a problem and still somehow manage not to see it. That afternoon, she made a decision that would change everything. If the grown folks weren't going to investigate those old mining sites, then she would have to do it herself. Her pressed wildflower wasn't just a memento of an afternoon's observation. It was evidence. And if there was more evidence to be found, she was going to find it, even if nobody wanted her to. The worn school book in Ora's hands had seen better days. Its blue cloth cover was faded to grey in places, the binding held together with careful stitches of thread her mother had salvaged from old clothes. Inside, the pages were filled with her neat handwriting, copying out lessons, working arithmetic problems, and along the margins, her own careful observations about the world around her. Today, those margins contained something different, a detailed record of Lucy McAllister's strange behavior, complete with dates, times, and locations. If anyone would listen to her concerns, Ora reasoned, they would need to see the pattern laid out clearly, the way her schoolbook laid out multiplication tables or grammar rules. She had decided to start with her family, approaching the subject with the careful logic her mother had taught her was essential for any serious discussion. "Mama," she began that evening after the dishes were cleared and her younger siblings had been sent to prepare for bed, "I've been keeping track of something, and I think you should see it." Constance Washington looked up from her mending needle, poised halfway through repairing a tear in Samuel's workshirt. "What kind of something?" Ora opened her schoolbook and showed her mother the margin notes she'd been making. "It's about Lucy McAllister. The times I've seen her acting strange. Where she was, what she was doing. See? There's a pattern." Her mother set down her sewing and accepted the book, studying Ora's careful notations with the same attention she gave to important letters or medical receipts. July 15th, seen at general store, hands shaking, staring toward back wall. Constance. Read aloud. July 22nd, walking with governess on Main Street, stumbling, head tilted like listening to something. July 29th, found sleepwalking in daylight toward old fields, speaking of singing well and voices underground. Moses Washington, who had been whittling a new handle for his hoe, looked up from his work. "You've been watching that child pretty." And close. Not watching her, Papa, just noticing when I see her, and what I've noticed is that she's always looking or moving toward the same direction. Toward those old mining fields you mentioned. Constance continued reading, her expression growing more troubled with each entry. August 3rd, seen outside post office, standing perfectly still for 5 minutes, staring east. August 7th, observed. From distance during family picnic, kept wandering away from blanket toward field edge until father retrieved her 3 separate times. This is detailed work, her mother said finally, closing the book and handing it back to Ora. But what do you think it means? Ora took a deep breath. I think something in those old fields is calling to her, something that's making her sick or confused. And I think if somebody doesn't figure out what it is soon, she's going to end up in real danger. The kitchen fell silent except for the steady tick of the wall clock and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. Samuel, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room with the expression of someone preparing to deliver unwelcome wisdom. Ora, you can't go around making accusations about white folks based on what some notes you made watching a little girl from a distance. I'm not making accusations, Ora protested. I'm just saying that something's wrong. And maybe if somebody looked into it, then it better be somebody else, her father interrupted firmly. Not us. Not you. Moses set down his whittling and looked directly at his daughter. Ora May, I know your heart's in the right place, but you need to understand something about the world we live in. When colored folks start suggesting that white folks don't know how to take care of their own children, that conversation doesn't end well for the colored folks. But what if I'm right? What if she's really in danger? Then her family will figure it out, Constance said gently. They have resources, education, the best medical care money can buy. If there's something wrong with their child, they'll find help for her. Ora felt frustration rising in her chest like floodwater. But they're not looking in the right place. They think it's something wrong with her, but what if it's something wrong with where she's going? That's enough, Moses said, his voice carrying the tone that meant discussion was over. You're not to go anywhere near those old fields, and you're not to go spreading stories about the McAllister family. Is that understood? Ora nodded reluctantly, but as she tucked her schoolbook under her arm and prepared for bed, she knew that understanding and agreeing were 2 different things entirely. The next morning brought a new opportunity when Mrs. Fletcher, the schoolteacher, asked Ora to stay after class to discuss her arithmetic work. Mrs. Fletcher was a young woman from back east who had come to Oklahoma with high ideals about education and the firm belief that knowledge could overcome any obstacle. She had always encouraged Ora's questions, praised her careful work, and treated her as a serious student rather than just another colored child filling a desk. Your mathematics has improved remarkably this term, Mrs. Fletcher said as she reviewed Ora's work. Your approach to problem-solving shows real analytical thinking. Thank you, ma'am, Ora replied, then hesitated. Mrs. Fletcher, can I ask you something about observation and evidence? Of course. What kind of observation? Ora opened her schoolbook to show her teacher the margin notes about Lucy McAllister. I've been noticing some strange behavior in a child from town, and I've been keeping track of it, like you taught us to keep track of our science observations. But when I tried to share my concerns with my family, they said it wasn't my place to notice such things. Mrs. Fletcher studied the careful notations, her expression growing thoughtful. This is very systematic work, Ora. You've documented dates, times, locations, and specific behaviors. What conclusion do you draw from this data? I think something in the environment is affecting her, something that's drawing her toward a particular location even when she's not fully conscious, and you've shared this theory with your family. Yes, Mom, but they think I should mind my own business. Mrs. Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, weighing her words carefully. Finally, she spoke with the measured tone of someone navigating treacherous territory. Ora, your methodology here is sound, and your observations are detailed and credible, But your family isn't wrong about the social realities you face. As much as I admire your analytical thinking, there are practical considerations about how such concerns might be received. Ora felt her heart sink. So you think I should ignore what I've seen? I think, Mrs. Fletcher said carefully, that you should consider whether there might be an indirect way to ensure that appropriate people become aware of the potential problem. What do you mean? Well, for instance, if someone with more social standing were to notice similar patterns and raise the same concerns, those concerns might receive a more favorable hearing. Ora understood immediately. Her teacher was suggesting that she find a white person to voice her observations, because the same information would carry more weight coming from a different source. The unfairness of it burned in her chest, but she also recognized the pragmatic wisdom in Mrs. Fletcher's suggestion. Who would I tell? She asked. Perhaps someone who already interacts with the McAllister family in a professional capacity. Someone who might be expected to notice if a child was exhibiting unusual behavior. That afternoon, Ora made her way to the home of Papa Jeremiah, the elderly man her father had mentioned who knew about the old mining operations. Jeremiah Washington, no relation despite the shared name, was 80 years old if he was a day, a former slave who had worked in mines throughout the South before coming to Oklahoma Territory as a free man. He lived in a small cabin on the edge of the colored section of town, surrounded by a garden that defied the prairie soil through sheer force of will and careful tending. When Ora knocked on his door, he greeted her with eyes that were cloudy with age, but still sharp with intelligence. "Well now, Miss Ora May," he said, settling onto his porch and indicating that she should take the chair beside him. "What brings you to visit an old man on a school day?" Ora showed him her schoolbook and explained her observations about Lucy McAllister. Papa Jeremiah listened without interruption, nodding occasionally and making small sounds of understanding. "Those old mining sites," he said when she finished. "I worked some of them myself, back when I was younger and more foolish. Tell me, child, this little girl, she always heads toward the same area?" "Yes, sir. Always toward the eastern edge of what used to be the old fields." Papa Jeremiah's expression grew serious. "That would be where they tried to dig for coal back in 83 and 84. Didn't find much coal, but they found something else, something that made them seal up the holes real quick and walk away from the whole operation." "What did they find?" "Gas," Papa Jeremiah said simply. "Natural gas seeping up from deep underground, but not the kind you can use for heating or lighting, the kind that makes you sick, makes you confused, makes you do things you wouldn't normally do." Ora felt her blood turn cold. "Is it dangerous?" "Can be if you're exposed to enough of it over time. Especially dangerous for children whose bodies are smaller and more sensitive to such things. And if those seal sites aren't properly maintained, then that gas could start seeping up again, especially after heavy rains or if the ground shifts." Papa Jeremiah studied Ora's face with concern. "Child, if what you're telling me is true, then that little girl is in real danger every time she wanders out to those fields. But who's going to believe us?" Ora asked, voicing the frustration that had been building all day. Papa Jeremiah smiled, an expression that held both sadness and hope. "Sometimes, child, the right information just needs to find the right ears. And sometimes the right ears belong to someone who's been waiting for someone else to speak up first." As Ora walked home that evening, her schoolbook tucked securely under her arm, she felt for the first time that her careful observations might actually lead to action. Papa Jeremiah had promised to think about the best way to bring her concerns to the right people, and his promise carried the weight of decades of experience in navigating the complex social currents of their community. But time, she feared, was running out for Lucy McAllister. The rusted mining pick lay half-buried in the sandy soil near the old creek bed, its wooden handle long since rotted away to leave only the corroded metal head. Ora pulled it free from the earth, feeling the weight of forgotten labor in her hands. The tool was a relic from the mining operations Papa Jeremiah had described, left behind when the work stopped abruptly and the workers moved on to more promising ground. But as Papa Jeremiah had explained the night before, sometimes the most dangerous discoveries were the ones that got abandoned rather than properly finished. "You sure about this, child?" Papa Jeremiah asked, adjusting the battered hat that protected his aged scalp from the morning sun. Despite his 80 years, he had insisted on accompanying Ora to examine the old mining sites, bringing with him the kind of knowledge that came from decades of working underground. "I'm sure we need to look," Ora replied, tucking the mining pick into her canvas bag alongside the other supplies they had gathered, a length of rope, a small lantern, and a bag of flour that Papa Jeremiah insisted they would need for reasons he hadn't yet explained. They stood at the edge of what had once been active mining ground, now overgrown with prairie grass and scattered mesquite. To most eyes, it looked like empty land that had never been touched by human hands. But Papa Jeremiah's experienced gaze could read the signs that others missed. Subtle depressions where shafts had been filled in, areas where the vegetation grew differently, and the telltale discoloration of soil that had been disturbed and never properly restored. "There," he said, pointing toward a section of ground about 50 yards away where the grass grew sparse and yellowed. "That's where they would have tried to sink their main shaft." As they walked toward the spot, Ora noticed other signs that supported Papa Jeremiah's assessment. The ground felt different underfoot, less solid, as if there were empty spaces beneath. The surface, small animals avoided the area entirely. Even the insects seemed less numerous here than in the surrounding grassland. "Why didn't they finish the work?" Ora asked as they approached the discolored patch of earth. "Found out the hard way that not all underground deposits are worth the risk," Papa Jeremiah replied. "Coal mining's dangerous enough when you're just dealing with cave-ins and underground rivers. When you start hitting pockets of bad gas, smart men walk away. But they sealed it up, right? That's what Mr. McAllister told Dr. Morrison." Papa Jeremiah knelt beside the yellowed patch of ground and pressed his ear to the earth, a gesture that looked almost like prayer. After a long moment, he sat back on his heels and shook his head. "They tried to seal it, but sealing a mine shaft properly takes time and money and expertise. When men are in a hurry to get away from something dangerous, they sometimes take shortcuts." To demonstrate his point, he took the bag of flour from their supplies and sprinkled a small handful over the ground. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, the flour began to move, not blown by wind, but stirred by something rising from below. "Gas," Papa Jeremiah said simply, "still seeping up after all these years. Probably gets worse when it rains heavy and the groundwater shifts." Ora stared at the slowly swirling flour with a mixture of fascination and horror. "How dangerous is It depends on how much and for how long. Small amounts over a short time might just make you feel dizzy or confused. Larger amounts, or breathing it regularly over weeks or months," he shrugged expressively, "could make you sick in ways that doctors might not recognize right away. And if a small child kept coming back to this spot, night after night, drawn by something she couldn't understand, then that child would be in serious trouble and nobody would know why. They spent the next hour exploring the area, using Papa Jeremiah's knowledge and Ora's careful observation skills to map the extent of the old mining operation. They found 3 more sites where gas was seeping from improperly sealed shafts, each one marked by the telltale signs of struggling vegetation and the flower test that Papa Jeremiah had taught her. More disturbing was the discovery of a clear path through the grass, not made by cattle or wild animals, but by small human feet that had passed this way many times. The path led directly from the McAllister property to the worst of the gas seeps, following a route that would bring someone into contact with the highest concentration of toxic fumes. "She's been coming here regularly," Ora said, studying the worn path with growing alarm. "Look how clear it is," Papa Jeremiah examined the footprints preserved in a patch of dried mud near the main seep site. Small feet, walking slow and careful like someone not fully awake. This child's been sleepwalking. Out here for weeks, maybe months. Why isn't she dead? Ora asked bluntly. Gas seepage varies, depending on weather and ground conditions. Some nights there might be just enough to make her confused and disoriented. Other nights there might be more, enough to make her really sick. But eventually, he didn't need to finish the sentence. They began the walk back toward town, in sobering silence, both of them understanding that they had uncovered a life-threatening situation that was getting worse with time. The question now was how to get someone in authority to take action before Lucy McAllister's next nocturnal wandering became her last. "Papa Jeremiah," Ora said as they paused to rest in the shade of a cottonwood tree, "what would happen if we just went directly to Mr. McAllister with what we found?" The old man considered her question carefully. In theory, he'd thank us for the information and take immediate steps to protect his daughter and properly seal those old shafts. And in reality, a rich white man might not appreciate being told by an old colored man and a young colored girl that his property is dangerous, and he's been negligent in maintaining it. Ora felt the familiar frustration of living in a world where being right wasn't nearly as important as being the right color to have your rightness taken seriously. "So what do we do?" Papa Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, watching a red-tailed hawk circle high overhead. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of long experience with the complicated business of survival in an unfair world. "We find someone who can speak for us, someone whose voice carries weight with the McAllister family." "Like who?" "Like Dr. Morrison. He's already suspicious that something environmental might be affecting the child. If the right information reached him, information that confirmed his medical instincts, he might be willing to investigate further." "But how do we get information to him without it being obvious that it came from us?" Papa Jeremiah smiled. The expression of someone who had spent decades finding indirect solutions to direct problems. "Child, you'd be amazed how often important information just happens to find its way to the right people at the right time." That evening, Ora sat at her family's kitchen table with the rusted mining pick beside her and a detailed map of the gas seepage sites spread out on the worn wood. She was copying her observations into clear, precise handwriting on a clean sheet of paper, the kind of report that might come from someone with official authority to investigate such matters. Her mother watched from her position at the stove, saying nothing but missing nothing. "You know what you're doing?" Constance asked finally. "I'm trying to save someone's life," Ora replied without looking up from her writing. "And if it goes wrong, if people start asking how a 12-year-old colored girl came to know so much about mining operations and gas seeps," Ora set down her pencil and looked at her mother directly. "Then I'll tell them the truth, that I noticed something dangerous and couldn't live with staying quiet about it." Constance Washington studied her daughter's face for a long moment, seeing there something that made her both proud and worried in equal measure. "Your papa's not going to like this," she said quietly. "Papa taught me to read sign and notice things that others miss. This is just me doing what he taught me to do. He also taught you to stay safe." Ora picked up the mining pick and turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of all the work it had done and all the dangers it had encountered before being abandoned to rust in the ground. "Mama," she said quietly, "sometimes staying safe and doing right are two different things, and sometimes you have to choose." That night, as the Oklahoma prairie settled into darkness around their small house, Ora finished her report and prepared to set in motion a plan that would either save Lucy McAllister's life or bring trouble to her own family that they might never escape. But as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the night sounds beyond the walls, she knew that some choices couldn't be unmade once you understood what was at stake. The rusted mining pick on her dresser caught the moonlight coming through her window, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous things were the ones that got left unfinished. abandoned to fester in the dark until someone finally had the courage to dig them up and face what had been hidden for too long. The white handkerchief in Mrs. McAllister's hand was pressed and starched to crisp perfection, embroidered with delicate blue flowers that matched her morning dress. She dabbed at her temples with practiced delicacy as she spoke to Sheriff Hawkins outside the general store, her voice carrying the particular tone that wealthy women used when discussing matters they found distasteful but necessary. "I don't want to cause trouble," Sarah McAllister was saying, "but we've had reports of someone lurking around our property, someone who doesn't belong there." Ora pressed herself closer to the side of the building, trying to remain invisible, while straining to hear every word of a conversation that seemed to be about her. "What kind of lurking, Mrs. McAllister?" Sheriff Hawkins asked, his voice respectful but weary. It was barely past 9 in the morning, and he already looked like a man who had dealt with more complaints than he cared to count. "Our foreman spotted a young colored girl near the old fields behind our property several times this past week. When he approached her yesterday, she ran off. My husband is concerned that she might be planning some kind of mischief." Sheriff Hawkins shifted his weight, his hand resting automatically on his gun belt. "Did anyone recognize the girl?" "We believe it's one of the Washington children, the ones who sharecrop the Hendricks land. The middle girl, Ora, I think her name is." Ora felt her stomach drop toward her feet. They had seen her investigating the mining sites with Papa Jeremiah, but apparently they had only noticed her presence, not his. Or perhaps they had simply chosen not to mention the elderly black man, who might have been harder to dismiss as a mere curious child. "I can have a talk with the family," Sheriff Hawkins said. "Make it clear that trespassing won't be tolerated." "I would appreciate that. With Lucy's health being so fragile lately, the last thing we need is strange children wandering around the property, possibly spreading diseases or causing disturbances." Mrs. McAllister folded her handkerchief carefully and tucked it into her reticule, the gesture somehow managing to convey both feminine delicacy and iron determination. "How is little Lucy doing?" Sheriff Hawkins asked, his tone softening with genuine concern. "Doc Morrison mentioned she's been having some troubles." "She's been having episodes," Mrs. McAllister replied carefully. "Sleepwalking, confusion, periods of weakness. Dr. Morrison believes it may be a nervous condition brought on by overstimulation. We're considering sending her to my sister in Dallas until she recovers." Ora wanted to scream. They were going to send Lucy away from the source of the problem instead of addressing the source itself. Worse, they were going to blame her own presence for Lucy's condition, when she was the only one who had identified what was actually causing the child's illness. As Sheriff Hawkins tipped his hat and promised to speak with the Washington family, that very afternoon, Ora slipped away from her hiding place and ran toward home, her mind racing faster than her feet. She needed to warn her parents about the sheriff's impending visit, but more urgently, she needed to figure out how to get the real information about the gas seepage to someone who would act on it before Lucy was sent away from the very help she found her father in the barn, oiling harness leather with the careful attention he gave to all his tools and equipment. When she burst through the door, breathless and frightened, he looked up with the immediate alertness of someone who had learned to recognize real trouble. "Papa," she gasped, "Sheriff Hawkins is coming here. Mrs. McAllister saw me near their property and thinks I'm planning mischief." Moses Washington set down his oiling rag and studied his daughter's face with the concentrated attention he usually reserved for reading weather signs or evaluating livestock. "What were you doing on their property, Ora May?" "I wasn't on their property. I was on the public land near the old mining sites, trying to understand what's making Lucy McAllister sick. But they don't know about the gas seepage, and they don't want to know. They just want to blame someone for their problems." "What gas seepage?" Ora realized she had never fully explained to her father what she and Papa Jeremiah had discovered. In her hurry to document the evidence and figure out how to get it to the right people, She had failed to prepare her own family for the consequences of her investigation. Quickly, she told him about the improperly sealed mine shafts, the toxic gas still seeping from underground, and the clear connection between Lucy's sleepwalking episodes and exposure to the dangerous fumes. Moses listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, processing both the information and its implications. "This is why you've been so worried about that child," he said finally. "Not just curious about strange behavior, but actually concerned about real danger." "Yes, Papa. And now they want to send her away to Dallas instead of fixing the real problem. And they're going to blame me for trespassing when all I was trying to do was help." Before Moses could respond, they heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Through the barn door, they could see Sheriff Hawkins riding up the path to their house, his official bearing making his purpose clear to anyone watching. "Stay in here," Moses instructed his daughter. "Let me handle this." But Ora had learned too much about the way the world worked to believe that staying hidden would protect her from the consequences of doing what she believed was right. "No, Papa. If this is about me, then I should be part of the conversation." Moses looked at his 12-year-old daughter for a long moment, seeing in her face a determination that reminded him of her mother and a stubbornness that was entirely her own. "All right," he said finally, "but you let me do the talking unless I ask you a direct question." They walked together toward the house, where Sheriff Hawkins was already dismounting and tying his horse to the fence post. Constance had emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron and wearing the carefully neutral expression that colored women learn to adopt when dealing with white officials. "Afternoon, Moses, Mrs. Washington," Sheriff Hawkins said, tipping his hat politely. "I need to have a word with you about your daughter." "What about her?" Moses asked, his voice level but wary. "There have been reports of her trespassing on the McAllister property. Mrs. McAllister is concerned that she might be planning some kind of trouble, especially given the family's current difficulties with their own daughter's health." Ora felt a flash of anger at the implication, but her father's steady presence beside her reminded her to stay calm and let him handle the situation. "Sheriff," Moses said carefully, "my daughter knows better than to trespass on anyone's property. If she was seen in that area, she was probably on public land. The McAllisters are claiming she was on their property, near some old fields they own. They want assurance that it won't happen again. What exactly do they think she was doing there?" Constance asked, her voice carrying just a hint of the protective steel that lay beneath her usual gentleness. Sheriff Hawkins shifted uncomfortably. "They're not sure, but with their little girl being sick and all, they're worried about outside influences that might be making the situation worse." The unfairness of it hit Ora like a physical blow. Lucy McAllister was being slowly poisoned by toxic gas seeping from abandoned mine shafts, but instead of investigating the real cause of her illness, her family preferred to blame a 12-year-old colored girl who had tried to help. "Sheriff Hawkins," Moses said quietly, "my daughter is many things, curious, observant, sometimes too bold for her own good. But she's not malicious, and she's certainly not the kind of child who would try to harm someone who's already sick." "I'm not saying she is," the sheriff replied, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "I'm just asking for your word that she'll stay away from the McAllister property so this doesn't become a bigger issue." Moses looked down at Ora, and she could see him weighing the cost of different responses. He could promise to keep her away from the area, which would ensure their family's safety, but might condemn Lucy to continued exposure to the toxic gas. Or he could try to explain what she had actually been doing, which might help Lucy, but would certainly bring more scrutiny to their own family. "Sheriff," Moses said finally, "what if there was a good reason for my daughter to be concerned about that area? What if she had observed something that might actually help the McAllister family understand what's wrong with their daughter?" Sheriff Hawkins frowned. What kind of something? Before Moses could answer, Ora stepped forward, her decision made. Sheriff Hawkins, Lucy McAllister isn't sick because of anything I did. She's sick because there are old mine shafts near her family's property that weren't properly sealed, and toxic gas is still seeping up from underground. Every time she sleepwalks toward those fields, she's breathing poison that makes her confused and weak. The sheriff stared at her with the expression of someone who couldn't decide whether to be amazed by her audacity or offended by her presumption. "Little girl," he said slowly, "those are some mighty serious accusations you're making." "They're not accusations," Ora replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite her racing heart. "They're observations, and if someone doesn't do something about those gas seeps soon, Lucy McAllister is going to die." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge that couldn't be taken back. Sheriff Hawkins looked from Ora to her parents, clearly struggling with how to respond to a situation that fell far outside his usual experience. Mrs. McAllister's pristine white handkerchief might represent the social barriers that kept people like Ora in their designated place. But Ora had just crossed those barriers as decisively as stepping over a fence line. The question now was whether anyone would listen to what she had found on the other side. The canary feather lay motionless in the yellowed grass, its bright golden color muted by death, but still unmistakable among the browns and greens of the prairie. Ora knelt beside it, her heart sinking as she understood what the small bird's presence meant. Canaries were sensitive to bad air. Miners had used them as warnings in underground tunnels for decades. If one had died here, it meant the gas concentration was worse than she and Papa Jeremiah had realized. She was alone this time, having slipped away from home before dawn while her family still slept. Sheriff Hawkins's visit the day before had ended with reluctant promises from her parents to keep her away from the McAllister property, but Ora knew that Lucy was running out of time. If the adults wouldn't listen to her warnings, then she had to gather evidence so compelling that they couldn't ignore it. The morning air was still and cool, perfect conditions for gas to accumulate in low-lying areas instead of dissipating into the atmosphere. Using the techniques Papa Jeremiah had taught her, Ora sprinkled flour from a small bag she had brought, watching as the white powder revealed invisible currents rising from the ground. What she saw made her stomach clench with fear. The gas seepage was much worse than it had been during their previous visit. The flour didn't just stir gently. It swirled and danced as if caught in an underground wind. Near the main shaft site, the concentration was so heavy that she could actually smell it. A sweet, sickening odor that made her feel dizzy after just a few breaths. She forced herself to move upwind and take several deep breaths of clean air before continuing her investigation. If the gas levels were this high in the early morning, what would they be like at night, when the air was even stiller and heavier? Following the trail that Lucy's feet had worn in the grass, Ora traced the path the sleepwalking child had taken. On her nocturnal wanderings, it led directly to the worst of the seepage areas, where the abandoned mine shaft had been sealed with nothing more than wooden planks and loose dirt. Over the years, weather and settling had opened gaps that allowed the toxic fumes to escape freely. But as she explored further, Ora made a discovery that chilled her more than the morning air. Hidden beneath a tangle of wild grapevines, she found a second pathway, not worn by Lucy's feet, but by the feet of other children. The prints were older, partially erased by rain and time, but still visible to someone who knew how to read sign. At least 2 other children, possibly more, had walked this same route toward the gas seeps. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Lucy wasn't the first child to be drawn to this spot by the effects of the toxic gas. Others had come before her, had breathed the poisonous fumes, had suffered the confusion and disorientation that made them vulnerable to further exposure, and some of them might not have survived. Ora began searching the area systematically, looking for evidence of other victims. What she found scattered among the grass and partially buried by years of prairie storms, told a story that made her hands shake with anger and grief. A child's shoe, small enough to belong to a 6-year-old, a torn piece of fabric from what had once been a nightgown, and near the deepest part of the main gas seep, a small pile of bones that might once have belonged to a dog or might have belonged to something else entirely. She forced herself to document everything, sketching the locations of each piece of evidence and writing careful descriptions in the notebook she had brought. But with each discovery, her sense of urgency grew stronger. Lucy McAllister was not just sick, she was following a path that other children had walked before her, a path that led to confusion, disorientation, and potentially death. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up from her grim documentation. Silas McAllister was riding across the field at a gallop, his face dark, with an emotion that might have been anger or fear or both. "You there," he called as he drew near. "What are you doing on my property?" Ora stood slowly, clutching her notebook and trying to think of words that might make him understand the magnitude of what she had discovered. "Mr. McAllister, sir, I'm trying to help your daughter. This place is dangerous. There's gas seeping up from old mine shafts that's making her sick." Silas swung down from his horse, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. "I don't need help from a trespassing child who has no business being here. My daughter is receiving the best medical care available. But Dr. Morrison doesn't know about the gas," Ora persisted, holding up the canary feather as evidence. "This bird died from breathing the fumes. Your daughter keeps sleepwalking here because the gas makes her confused and disoriented, but every time she comes here, she breathes more poison." "That's enough." Silas's voice cracked like a whip across the morning air. "I don't know what game you're playing, but it ends now. My daughter's illness has nothing to do with abandoned mining operations that were sealed decades ago." "They weren't sealed properly," Ora said desperately. "Look at the ground where your daughter always goes when she sleepwalks. Use some flour to see the gas coming up. Test it yourself." For a moment, she thought she saw uncertainty flicker across his face, but it was quickly replaced by the harder expression of a man who had made up his mind and refused to be swayed by evidence that contradicted his conclusions. "My daughter is going to Dallas next week to stay with her aunt until her health improves," he said firmly. "She'll be away from whatever influences have been affecting her here." "But taking her away won't solve the problem," Ora argued. "The gas will still be here. Still dangerous to anyone who gets too close. What about other children? What about your own ranch hands?" "There are no other children at risk because there is no gas," Silas said, with the finality of someone ending a discussion. "There are only wild stories from a girl who has been caught trespassing repeatedly on private property." He remounted his horse and looked down at her with an expression that mixed dismissal with warning. "If I catch you on my land again, I'll have Sheriff Hawkins arrest you for trespassing and disturbing the peace. Is that understood?" Ora nodded, knowing that arguing further would only make things worse. But as Silas rode away, she clutched the canary feather and promised herself that his refusal to listen would not be the end of the story. That afternoon, she sought out Papa Jeremiah and showed him everything she had documented. The increased gas seepage, the evidence of other children who had been affected, and the clear signs that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. "Child," he said after examining her notes and sketches, "this is worse than I thought. That gas concentration is high enough to kill someone who spent too much time breathing it. Mr. McAllister won't listen. He's sending Lucy to Dallas, and he thinks that will solve the problem." Papa Jeremiah studied the canary feather with the serious attention of someone who understood exactly what it represented. "Sometimes," he said finally, "when people in authority won't listen to the truth, you have to find a way to make the truth impossible to ignore." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Dr. Morrison is a good man who genuinely wants to help that child. And if certain information found its way to him, information that confirmed his suspicions about environmental factors, he might be willing to investigate on his own. But how do we get the information to him without it being obvious where it came from?" Papa Jeremiah smiled, the expression of someone who had spent decades finding creative solutions to impossible problems. Child, you'd be amazed how often important evidence just happens to turn up in places where the right people can't help but notice it. That evening, as Ora carefully preserved the canary feather between the pages of her notebook, she understood that she had reached a crossroads. She could accept defeat and let Lucy McAllister be taken away from the source of her poisoning while the real danger remained hidden and deadly, or she could take one final desperate action to ensure that the truth reached someone who would act on it. The small yellow feather caught the lamplight like a warning flag, reminding her that nature had its own ways of signaling danger to those who knew how to read the signs. The question now was whether she had the courage to make sure those signs reached the right eyes before it was too late. Outside her window, the Oklahoma night settled over the prairie with its deceptive peace, hiding beneath its quiet surface. The slow-moving disaster that continued to seep upward from the abandoned places where men had once dug into the earth and then walked away without finishing what they had started. The broken lantern glass lay scattered across Dr. Morrison's porch steps, its pieces catching the late afternoon sunlight like fragments of deadly truth finally brought into the open. Ora stared at the shattered remains of what had been her last desperate attempt to get crucial information to the only adult who might act on it. She had crept up to the doctor's house just after dawn, intending to leave her carefully documented evidence where he would find it when he emerged for his morning constitutional, but her nervous hands had fumbled the lantern she'd borrowed to see by, and the crash of breaking glass had sent her running before she could complete her mission. Now, standing in the shadow of the oak trees that lined the doctor's property, she watched as Dr. Morrison himself emerged from his house to investigate the disturbance. Her heart sank as she saw him sweep up the glass fragments and toss them into his waste bin, apparently dismissing the incident as the work of mischievous children. But then something made him pause. Among the glass shards, her notebook had fallen, open to the page where she'd carefully sketched the locations of the gas seeps and documented Lucy's sleepwalking patterns. Dr. Morrison picked up the notebook, his expression growing more serious as he read her detailed observations. Ora held her breath as she watched him study her work, hoping desperately that he would understand what she had risked everything to share with him. The sound of rapidly approaching hoofbeats shattered the morning quiet. Miss Pemberton, Lucy's governess, rode up to Dr. Morrison's house in a state of obvious panic, her usually perfect posture abandoned in favor of desperate urgency. "Dr. Morrison," she called out before she had even dismounted. "You must come. Immediately, something's terribly wrong with her." Dr. Morrison tucked Ora's notebook into his coat pocket and hurried to help Miss Pemberton down from her horse. "What's happened?" "She collapsed during breakfast," Miss Pemberton said, her voice shaking with fear and exhaustion. "She was sitting at the table, talking about the singing getting louder, and then her eyes rolled back and she fell from her chair. We can't wake her up properly. She keeps muttering about voices underground, but when we try to rouse her, she doesn't recognize us." Dr. Morrison's face went pale. "How long has she been unconscious?" "Nearly an hour now. Mrs. McAllister is beside herself, and Mr. McAllister has ridden to town to send for a specialist from Oklahoma City. But I was afraid we didn't have time to wait." "You were right to come to me immediately," Dr. Morrison interrupted, already moving toward his medical bag. "Help me hitch the buggy. We need to get to her as quickly as possible." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Morrison pulled Ora's notebook from his pocket and studied it once more, his expression growing grim as he connected her observations with Lucy's current crisis. "Miss Pemberton," he said urgently, "in this notebook, there are references to old mining operations near the McAllister property. Do you know anything about that?" "Mining operations?" Miss Pemberton looked confused. "I don't think so. Although, well, Lucy has been talking about the singing well for weeks." She says it calls to her at night, tells her to come find where the voices are coming from. Dr. Morrison's expression shifted from concern to alarm. Where exactly does she go when she sleepwalks? To the old fields behind the house. Always to the same area, no matter where we start her from. She walks there like she knows exactly where she's going, even with her eyes closed. From her hiding place, Ora watched as the full realization dawned on Dr. Morrison's face. He understood now what she had been trying to tell everyone. Lucy wasn't suffering from a nervous condition or childhood hysteria. She was being poisoned by toxic gas that was affecting her brain, making her disoriented and drawn to the very source of the poison that was killing her. "We need to move her away from that area immediately," Dr. Morrison said as he climbed into the buggy. "And we need to keep her away from those old fields permanently." But as they drove toward the McAllister ranch, Ora realized with growing horror that they might already be too late. She had seen the gas seepage levels that morning, had watched the flour swirl in dangerous concentrations that were far worse than anything Papa Jeremiah had witnessed during their previous visits. The recent heavy rains had shifted the underground water tables, increasing the pressure that forced the toxic fumes up through the inadequate seals on the old mine shafts. If Lucy had been exposed to those higher concentrations during her sleepwalking episodes over the past few weeks, the cumulative effect might have reached a critical threshold. Her collapse during breakfast might not be just another episode. It might be her body finally succumbing to months of gradual poisoning. Ora made a decision that she knew would change everything. Instead of staying hidden and hoping that Dr. Morrison's intervention would be enough, she ran toward the McAllister ranch as fast as her legs could carry her. She arrived to find the household in chaos. Servants hurried back and forth with hot water and cool cloths, while Mrs. McAllister paced the front porch, wringing her hands and demanding updates from anyone who entered or left the house. Dr. Morrison's buggy was already there, his medical bag sitting on the porch steps, while he examined Lucy inside. Through the open windows, Ora could hear fragments of urgent conversation. Pulses weak and irregular, pupils responding slowly to light, symptoms consistent with some form of poisoning. Ora crept closer to the window, desperate to hear what Dr. Morrison was saying about Lucy's condition and whether her notebook had provided him with the information he needed to make the right diagnosis. "Mrs. McAllister," she heard Dr. Morrison say, "I need you to tell me exactly where your daughter goes when she sleepwalks. The precise location." "To the old fields, Doctor. Always to the same spot. We found her there dozens of times over the past 2 months. And this spot, is it near any old mining operations?" Mrs. McAllister's voice carried confusion and growing alarm. "Mining operations? Well, Silas did mention that there had been some exploratory work done on the property before we bought it, but that was 20 years ago. Ma'am, I believe your daughter has been exposed to toxic gas seeping from improperly sealed mine shafts. The concentration appears to be high enough to cause serious neurological damage if the exposure continues." The silence that followed was broken by Mrs. McAllister's sharp intake of breath. Are you telling me that my daughter is being poisoned by our own property?" "I'm saying that's a very real possibility, and we need to test the air quality in that area immediately. More importantly, we need to ensure that Lucy is never exposed to those fumes again." Through the window, Ora could see Lucy lying motionless on her bed, her small face pale and her breathing shallow. The sight filled her with a mixture of vindication and terrible fear. She had been right about the source of Lucy's illness, but being right might not be enough to save the child's life if the damage was already too severe. Dr. Morrison emerged from the house, his face grave as he spoke to Mrs. McAllister in low, urgent tones. "Her condition is critical. The neurological symptoms suggest prolonged exposure to hydrogen sulfide or a similar toxic gas. We need to get her to Oklahoma City immediately, to a hospital with better facilities for treating poisoning cases." But will she? Mrs. McAllister couldn't finish the question. I don't know, Dr. Morrison replied honestly. The next 24 hours will tell us whether the damage is reversible. But Mrs. McAllister, if my suspicions are correct, this wasn't just an accident. Someone has been trying to warn your family about this danger. He pulled Ora's notebook from his coat and showed it to Mrs. McAllister. These observations are detailed, methodical, and accurate. Someone has been documenting your daughter's symptoms and their connection to those old mining sites for weeks, possibly months. Mrs. McAllister stared at the notebook with dawning comprehension. The Washington girl. Silas said she'd been trespassing, but she wasn't trespassing at all, was she? She was trying to help Lucy. It appears so. And if we had listened to her warnings earlier, Dr. Morrison didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the air between them. As they prepared to transport Lucy to Oklahoma City, Ora stepped out from her hiding place behind the oak tree. Mrs. McAllister saw her first, and instead of anger or accusation, her face showed something that looked like desperate gratitude mixed with overwhelming guilt. You tried to warn us, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You knew what was wrong with her and we wouldn't listen. Ora nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The broken lantern glass had shattered more than just a simple light. It had shattered the illusions and prejudices that had prevented the adults from seeing the truth that had been right in front of them all along. But as she watched them load Lucy's unconscious form into Dr. Morrison's buggy for the desperate race to Oklahoma City, Ora couldn't shake the fear that her victory in finally being heard might have come too late to save the life she had fought so hard to protect. The afternoon sun slanted across the prairie as the buggy disappeared toward town, carrying with it a small girl whose only crime had been living near a place where men had once dug into the earth and then walked away without properly cleaning up the dangers they had unleashed. Behind them, the old mining sites continued their silent, deadly seepage, waiting for the next vulnerable victim to wander into their invisible embrace. The rope lay coiled beside Ora's bed, 30 feet of hemp that her father used for securing loads and pulling wagons out of mud. She had borrowed it while he slept, along with the small knife he used for cutting leather and the lantern that had replaced the one she'd broken at Dr. Morrison's house. Tonight, these simple tools might be all that stood between Lucy McAllister and death. It had been 3 days since Lucy's collapse, 3 days since Dr. Morrison had rushed her to Oklahoma City, while the adults finally began to understand the magnitude of their oversight. But the specialist at the hospital had determined that Lucy needed to return home. Not because she was better, but because her condition was so delicate that the stress of being in an unfamiliar place was making her worse. She was dying, and everyone knew it. The gas poisoning had affected her nervous system more severely than anyone had initially realized. Her periods of consciousness were brief and confused, and during her sleeping hours, she exhibited a behavior that terrified everyone who witnessed it. She would rise from her bed and walk with mechanical precision toward the very fields that had been poisoning her, as if some part of her brain remained locked in the pattern that was killing her. Dr. Morrison had recommended restraining her, but the physical struggle of being held down only seemed to agitate her more, sending her heart rate soaring to dangerous levels. The family was trapped in an impossible situation. They couldn't let her go to the gas seeps, but they couldn't force her to stay away without potentially killing her from the stress. Ora had learned all of this by listening at windows and lurking behind buildings, gathering information the way she had learned to gather everything else, quietly, carefully, without drawing attention to herself. The adult world had finally acknowledged that she had been right, but being right hadn't earned her a place at the table where decisions were being made about Lucy's care. That was about to change. The storm that had been building all day finally broke just after midnight, sending sheets of rain across the prairie with the kind of intensity that made the very air feel heavy and dangerous. Ora knew from Papa Jeremiah's teachings that such weather would make the gas seepage worse, trapping the toxic fumes close to the ground where they would accumulate in deadly concentrations. If Lucy had another sleepwalking episode tonight, the combination of increased gas levels and the disorienting effects of the storm could be fatal. Ora dressed quickly in her darkest clothes, wrapping the rope around her waist and tucking the knife and lantern into a canvas bag that would protect them from the rain. She had no specific plan beyond staying close enough to the McAllister house to intervene if Lucy began another nocturnal wandering. But she knew that sitting at home, doing nothing, was not an option she could live with. The rain turned the familiar landscape into something alien and treacherous. Paths disappeared under rushing water, and the usual landmarks were obscured by sheets of precipitation that made seeing more than a few yards ahead nearly impossible. But Ora had spent her entire life learning to navigate by more than just sight, and she made her way toward the McAllister ranch, guided by instinct and the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the way forward. She reached the ranch house just as the storm reached its peak intensity. Through the rain-streaked windows, she could see lights burning in several rooms, the family keeping vigil over Lucy's deteriorating condition. Dr. Morrison's buggy was tied up outside, suggesting that the doctor had decided to stay close in case of emergency. Ora found shelter beneath a large oak tree about 50 yards from the house, close enough to see any movement toward the dangerous fields, but far enough away to avoid detection. The rope around her waist felt both reassuring and ominous, a reminder that she might soon need to risk her own life to save someone who had been dismissed as beyond help. She didn't have to wait long. A little after 1 in the morning, she saw a small white figure emerge from the back door of the house and begin walking steadily toward the old mining area. Even through the driving rain, there was no mistaking the mechanical, purposeful gait of someone sleepwalking toward a destination that existed only in her poisoned dreams. Lucy was heading for the gas seeps. Ora left her shelter and began following. At a distance, her heart pounding with fear and determination. She could see lights moving in the house behind them. The family had discovered Lucy's absence and was organizing a search. But in this weather, with visibility reduced to almost nothing, they would have trouble following Lucy's path until it was too late. The child moved with uncanny precision through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate in darkness and rain. She avoided obstacles, stepped around holes and streams, and maintained a direct course toward the most dangerous of the gas seepage areas, as if she were following a map that only she could see. Ora realized with growing alarm that this wasn't just another sleepwalking episode. This was Lucy's brain, damaged by months of poison exposure, following the most deeply ingrained pattern it knew, the route to the source of the substance that had been controlling her behavior all along. TTU. Rain was making the situation even worse. Ora could smell the gas fumes getting stronger as they approached the old mining sites. The toxic vapors, concentrated by the storm into a deadly fog that hung close to the ground. Lucy was walking directly into a cloud of poison that would finish what months of gradual exposure had started. "Lucy!" Ora called out, knowing that shouting was unlikely to wake someone in such a deep fugue state, but desperate to try anything that might break the spell. The child didn't respond, didn't even slow down. She was within 20 yards of the main gas seep now, close enough that Ora could see her small figure wavering as if the toxic fumes were already affecting her balance and coordination. Ora made her decision. She ran forward, uncoiling the rope. As she moved and threw herself between Lucy and the worst of the gas seepage, the fumes hit her immediately, a sweet, sickening smell that made her head spin and her stomach lurch. But she forced herself to keep moving, to reach Lucy before the child could take another step into the deadly cloud. "Lucy, wake up!" she shouted, grabbing the smaller girl's shoulders and trying to turn her away from the gas seep. "You have to wake up!" Lucy's eyes opened, but there was no recognition in them, no awareness of where she was or what was happening. She struggled against Ora's grip with surprising strength, trying to continue toward the source of the singing only she could hear. "The voices," Lucy murmured, her words slurred by the effects of the gas and the lingering damage from her previous exposures. "They're calling so loud now, I have to find where they're coming from. There are no voices." Ora gasped, fighting both Lucy's resistance and her own growing disorientation from breathing the toxic fumes. "It's just the gas making you think you hear things." But Lucy was beyond rational argument. The poison that had been slowly damaging her brain for months had left her unable to distinguish between reality and the hallucinations that drove her toward the source of her destruction. Ora realized that she had only one option. She had to physically remove Lucy from the area, carrying her to safety, even if it meant exposing herself to dangerous levels of the toxic gas. She tied one end of the rope around Lucy's waist, creating a harness that would allow her to pull the child to safety, even if Lucy continued to struggle. The other end she tied around her own waist, creating a lifeline that connected them both to the possibility of survival. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Lucy, knowing that what she was about to do would be frightening and potentially harmful to a child in such a delicate condition. "But I can't let you die." The struggle that followed seemed to last forever. Lucy fought with the desperate strength of someone whose poisoned mind believed she was being prevented from reaching salvation, while Ora fought with the determined strength of someone who understood that salvation lay in the opposite direction. The gas fumes made everything worse, affecting Ora's vision and balance, while the rain turned the ground beneath their feet into treacherous mud. Several times she nearly lost her footing, and once she felt herself beginning to succumb to the same disorientation that was driving Lucy toward the deadly seepage. But the rope held them together, and her grip on consciousness held just long. Enough for her to begin pulling Lucy away from the gas seep and toward cleaner air. Behind them, she could see lights approaching through the rain, Dr. Morrison and the McAllister family following their path with lanterns and calling Lucy's name. But they were still several minutes away, and Ora knew that minutes might be too long if Lucy continued to breathe the concentrated fumes. "Please," she gasped, addressing her words to Lucy, but really speaking to whatever force might be listening to the prayers of a 12-year-old girl trying to save a life. "Please let me get her out of here." Step by step, foot by foot, she pulled Lucy away from the gas seep and toward the cleaner air that lay upwind of the mining sites. The rope between them became more than just a physical connection. It became a lifeline that bridged the gap between life and death, between the world of the poisoned and the world of the healthy. Lucy's struggles began to weaken as they moved away from the most concentrated fumes, and Ora felt a spark of hope that they might both survive this desperate rescue attempt. But she also knew that the real danger wasn't over. Lucy's exposure to the gas tonight, on top of all her previous exposures, might have pushed her past the point where recovery was possible. The approaching lights grew brighter, and she could hear Dr. Morrison's voice calling instructions to the others as they organized their own rescue effort. But it was Ora who had reached Lucy first, Ora who had prevented the child from walking into the heart of the deadly gas cloud, and Ora whose rope now served as the only thing keeping both of them connected to the possibility of making it through this night alive. As the adult rescuers finally reached them, their lanterns revealing two small figures bound together by rope and determination in the middle of a deadly storm, Ora felt the satisfaction of knowing that this time her voice had been heard not through words, but through action. The rope that connected her to Lucy McAllister had become a bridge across more than just physical distance. It had become a bridge across the social and racial divides that had nearly prevented this rescue from happening at all. The handful of dirt in Ora's palm was cold and wet from the storm, but it felt solid and real in a way that gave her courage. When everything else seemed to be dissolving into chaos, She had grabbed it instinctively when she first threw herself between Lucy and the gas seep, a gesture born from her father's teaching that sometimes you needed to hold on to something tangible when the world around you stopped making sense. Now, as she struggled to pull Lucy away from the deadly fumes, that dirt represented something more than just earth. It represented the solid ground of truth that she had been standing on all along, even when no one else would acknowledge it. Dr. Morrison reached them first, his lantern cutting through the rain and darkness to illuminate a scene that would remain burned in his memory for the rest of his life. Two young girls connected by rope in the middle of a toxic cloud, one unconscious from gas exposure and the other fighting to save them both, despite her own growing disorientation. "Dear God," he breathed, immediately understanding what Ora had done and why. "How long have you been breathing these fumes?" "Not long," Ora gasped, though her voice was already showing the effects of her exposure to the gas. But Lucy walked straight into the worst of it. "I tied us together so I wouldn't lose her if I started getting confused too." Dr. Morrison quickly assessed the situation with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with poisoning cases before. Lucy was unconscious but breathing, her pulse weak but steady. Ora was conscious but showing signs of early gas exposure, dilated pupils, unsteady movement, and the slightly slurred speech that indicated the toxic fumes were affecting her nervous system. "We need to get both of you away from here immediately," he said, already working to untie the rope that connected them. "Can you walk?" "I think so," Ora replied, though her legs felt unsteady beneath her. "But Lucy can't. She's too deep under the influence of the gas." Silas and Sarah McAllister arrived just as Dr. Morrison was lifting Lucy into his arms, their faces showing a mixture of terror and guilt that spoke to their understanding of how close they had come to losing their daughter. "Permanently. Will she? Sarah couldn't finish the question, her hands reaching for her daughter while her mind tried to process the scene before her. "She's alive," Dr. Morrison said grimly, "but this exposure on top of all the previous ones, we need to get her to clean air immediately, and then we need to keep her away from this area permanently." As they began the careful journey back toward the house, Ora found herself struggling more than she had expected. The gas exposure was affecting her balance and coordination, making it difficult to navigate the muddy, rain-slicked terrain. Several times she stumbled, and once she would have fallen completely if Silas McAllister hadn't reached out to steady her. "Easy there," he said, his voice carrying a gentleness that she had never heard from him before. "You've breathed enough of that poison to fell a grown man." "I'm all right," Ora insisted, though her voice sounded strange and distant even to her own ears. "I just need to make sure Lucy gets to safety." "You've done that already," Sarah McAllister said, walking beside them with tears streaming down her face. "You saved her life. You saved our daughter's life when we were too blind and stubborn to see the danger ourselves." The words hit Ora with more impact than the gas fumes had. For months, she had been fighting to make someone understand what she could see so clearly, struggling against the dismissal and suspicion that met her every attempt to help. Now, in the middle of a storm, with toxic gas swirling around them and a child's life hanging in the balance, the truth had finally become impossible to ignore, but recognition came with its own kind of weight. As they made their way through the rain toward the lights of the house, Ora realized that her handful of dirt represented more than just solid ground. It represented the responsibility that came with being right about something that mattered. She had proven that she could see dangers that others missed, that her observations were valuable and her instincts sound. But she had also learned that being right about deadly serious matters meant carrying the burden of that knowledge, even when others weren't ready to hear it. The house, when they finally reached it, blazed with lights and activity. Servants rushed to prepare hot water and clean clothes, while Dr. Morrison worked to assess the full extent of Lucy's gas exposure. The child remained unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady, her small body fighting the effects of months of accumulated poison. Ora found herself seated in the McAllisters' kitchen, wrapped in blankets and drinking hot tea, while Dr. Morrison checked her eyes and pulse. The handful of dirt still clutched in her palm had dried to a fine dust, but she continued to hold onto it as a reminder of the solid ground she had chosen to stand on. "You'll both recover from tonight's exposure," Dr. Morrison told the assembled adults, his voice carrying cautious optimism. "But Lucy's cumulative exposure over the past months means her recovery will be slower and less certain. We won't know the full extent of the neurological damage until she regains consciousness." "And if she doesn't regain consciousness?" Sarah asked quietly. Dr. Morrison was quiet for a moment before answering. "Then we'll know that we waited too long to listen to the warnings we were given." In the silence that followed, Ora opened her hand and let the dried dirt fall to the floor, scattering across the polished wood like evidence of a truth that could no longer be denied. The earth that had concealed the danger for so long had also provided the solid ground she needed to stand firm against disbelief and dismissal. Tomorrow there would be consequences to face and decisions to make about the toxic mining sites that continued to threaten anyone who came too close. But tonight, in the warm kitchen of the house where she had once been seen as a trespassing nuisance, Ora Washington had proven that some voices deserved to be heard regardless of the age or color of the person speaking. The rescue had only just begun, but the hardest part, making someone listen, was finally behind her. The child's small shoe lay forgotten beside Lucy's bed, muddy and torn from her nighttime journey through the storm. It was barely large enough to fit a doll, a reminder of how young and vulnerable the girl was who had been fighting for her life against an enemy she couldn't see or understand. Ora sat in the chair beside the bed, watching Lucy's face for any sign of returning consciousness. It had been 6 hours since the rescue, and Dr. Morrison had cautiously pronounced both girls out of immediate danger from their gas exposure. But Lucy remained unconscious, her breathing steady, but her mind apparently still trapped somewhere. Between waking and sleeping, the neurological effects can linger, Dr. Morrison had explained to the assembled family. Her brain has been fighting the poison for months. It may take time for normal function to return, if it returns at all. The if hung in the air like an unspoken verdict. They had prevented Lucy from dying in the gas seeps, but they still didn't know whether they had acted soon enough to prevent permanent damage to her developing mind. Sarah McAllister entered the room carrying a cup of broth, her face showing the strain of a sleepless night spent confronting the magnitude of their oversight. "Any change?" she asked quietly, setting the cup on the bedside table. "Not yet," Ora replied, but her breathing seemed stronger than it was earlier. Sarah studied her daughter's pale face, then looked at Ora with an expression that mixed gratitude with something that might have been shame. "I need you to know," she said carefully, "that my husband and I understand what you did for our family. Not just last night, but these past months when you were trying to warn us about the danger." Ora nodded, not sure what response was expected from her. "We also understand," Sarah continued, "that our failure to listen to you nearly cost Lucy her life, and that even now her recovery is uncertain because we waited too long to take your warnings seriously." Before Ora could respond, Lucy's eyes fluttered open. For a moment she stared at the ceiling with confusion, then turned her head to look around the room. "Mama," she whispered, her voice hoarse but recognizable. Sarah was beside the bed in an instant, tears streaming down her face as she took her daughter's small hand in both of hers. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're safe now." Lucy's gaze moved around the room, taking in the familiar surroundings with what appeared to be genuine recognition. When her eyes fell on Ora, she studied her face with the intense concentration of someone trying to remember something important. "You're the girl from town," she said finally, "the one who was always watching me." "Yes," Ora replied simply. Was watching because I was worried about you. I kept hearing voices, Lucy said, her words coming slowly as if she were pulling them from a great distance. They were calling me to come find them, but they weren't really there, were they? No, they weren't real. It was the poison making you think you heard them. Lucy was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to trust everything her mind told her. The poison came from underground, from old mine shafts that weren't properly sealed. Gas was seeping up that made you confused and sick. And you figured that out when the grown-ups couldn't? Ora glanced at Sarah McAllister, who nodded encouragingly. Sometimes children notice things that adults miss, Ora said diplomatically. Lucy managed a small smile. Sometimes grown-ups don't want to listen to children, even when the children are right. Dr. Morrison chose that moment to enter the room, his medical bag in hand and his face showing cautious optimism. "Well now," he said, approaching the bed, with the gentle manner he used with his youngest patients. "Someone's decided to rejoin the waking world." "Dr. Morrison," Lucy said clearly, "am I going to be all right?" The doctor sat down beside the bed and began his examination, checking Lucy's eyes, pulse and reflexes with careful thoroughness. "Your body is doing its best to heal from the poison you've been breathing," he said honestly. "The fact that you're awake and talking clearly is a very good sign, but it may take time for all the effects to fade away." "Will I still hear the voices?" "I don't believe so. The voices were caused by the gas affecting your brain. Now that we know what was causing them, we can make sure you're never exposed to those fumes again." As Dr. Morrison continued his examination, Ora picked up Lucy's small shoe from beside the bed. It was so tiny, so fragile, that it was hard to imagine the courage it had taken for feet that small to walk night after night toward what her confused mind believed was salvation. "Lucy," Ora said gently, "I found this by your bed. It came off." During the storm last night, Lucy looked at the muddy shoe with recognition. "I remember walking in the rain, and I remember you being there, pulling me back from somewhere I wanted to go. You wanted to go there because the poison was affecting your thinking, but the real you, the healthy you, didn't want to go there at all." Lucy nodded slowly, her expression showing the kind of mature understanding that sometimes comes to children who have faced dangers beyond their years. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not letting me go where the poison wanted me to go." Dr. Morrison finished his examination with obvious relief. Her reflexes are normal, her mental clarity appears intact, and her physical coordination is returning to baseline. I believe we can be cautiously optimistic about her full recovery. The room exhaled collectively, months of tension finally beginning to dissolve into the kind of relief that comes after a crisis has passed and survival is no longer in question. But as Ora looked at the small shoe in her hands, she understood that Lucy's recovery was only part of the larger story that had been unfolding. The real question was whether the lessons learned during this crisis would change how the community listened to voices that had previously been dismissed or ignored. The child's shoe was tiny, vulnerable, easily overlooked, much like the warnings that had been ignored for too long. But it had also proven to be connected to a courage and determination much larger than its size suggested. Some voices, Ora had learned, were worth hearing regardless of how small they seemed or where they came from. The faded photograph in Ora's weathered hands showed two young girls standing together in front of the McAllister ranch house, their arms linked despite the decades of social convention that should have kept them separated. Lucy McAllister, pale but smiling in her recovery, stood beside Ora Washington, whose expression held the quiet satisfaction of someone who had spoken truth and finally been heard. The photograph was dated September 1911, just 2 months after, the night that had changed everything for both girls and their families. That was taken the day they sealed the last of the mining shafts, Ora tells the documentary camera, her voice carrying the warmth of a memory that had grown sweeter with time rather than bitter. Proper sealing this time, with concrete and steel and engineers from Oklahoma City who knew how to do the job right. She adjusts the photograph in her hands, careful not to crack the fragile paper that has preserved this moment for more than 50 years. Silas McAllister spared no expense once he understood what those gas seeps could do. Brought in specialists, had every inch of his property tested, and made sure that no other child would ever be poisoned the way Lucy had been. The filmmaker leans forward slightly, drawn by the obvious affection in Ora's voice when she speaks of the McAllister family. "And, Lucy, how was her recovery?" Ora's smile deepens, transforming her lined face into something radiant. Lucy recovered completely, though it took the better part of a year. Her parents were so grateful and so ashamed of how they'd treated my warnings that they insisted on doing something to make amends. They couldn't take back the months of dismissing me, but they could make sure it never happened to anyone else. She sets the photograph carefully on the small table beside her chair and looks directly into the camera. That's when everything changed, not just for me, but for a lot of folks in our community. The McAllisters used their influence to establish the first Environmental Safety Commission in Creek County, with Papa Jeremiah as the chief inspector. Can you imagine an 80-year-old former slave given official authority to investigate dangerous conditions on white folks' property? The irony isn't lost on either Ora or her interviewer. The same man whose knowledge had been essential to solving the crisis was now empowered to prevent similar crises from occurring. Papa Jeremiah lived another 8 years, and he spent every one of them making sure that abandoned mining operations throughout the county were properly identified and sealed. He used to say that the earth remembers every hole we dig in it. And if we don't tend to our business properly, the earth will remind us in ways we might not like. Ora picks up the photograph again, studying the faces of her younger self and Lucy McAllister with the perspective that only comes with decades of reflection. Lucy and I became friends after that night in the storm. Real friends, not just two. Children who happened to know each other. Her parents made sure I was welcomed at their house, and my parents, well, they learned to be proud of their daughter who had saved a life instead of worried about their daughter who had caused trouble. She pauses, her expression growing more serious. But it wasn't always easy. There were plenty of folks in town who thought the McAllisters were going too far, treating a colored family with too much respect, giving too much credit to a child who should have minded her own business. Change doesn't come without resistance, even when that change is obviously right. How did you handle the criticism? Ora considers the question carefully, her fingers tracing the edge of the old photograph. I learned something important that year about the difference between being right and being heard. Being right is something you can do all by yourself. You observe, you think, you reach accurate conclusions. But being heard requires other people to be willing to listen, and that's something you can't control no matter how right you are. She looks out across the prairie that stretches beyond her porch, the same landscape that had hidden deadly secrets for so long. What I could control was whether I kept speaking the truth even when it seemed like nobody was listening. And what I learned is that sometimes the most important conversations happen long after you think you've been ignored. The filmmaker asks about Ora's later life, and she shares the story with the measured pace of someone who has learned to value each chapter of her existence. I finished my schooling with help from the McAllister family, who insisted on paying for my education as part of their way of making amends. Became a teacher myself, spent 40 years in classrooms throughout Oklahoma, always telling my students to trust their observations and speak up when they notice something important, even if the grown-ups weren't ready to listen. She married young, had 4 children of her own, and raised them with the understanding that their voices mattered regardless of what others might think. Her husband, Samuel Turner, was a man who had learned from her example that courage was often quiet and that the most important battles were sometimes fought by people who never expected to be heroes. Lucy kept in touch through all those years. Ora continues, her voice soft with affection. She married a doctor, had children of her own, and never forgot that a 12-year-old colored girl had saved her life when the adults had failed her. Every Christmas, I'd get a letter from wherever she was living, thanking me again for not giving up on her. The photograph shows the beginning of that friendship, but Ora's voice carries the weight of decades of correspondence, mutual support, and the kind of connection that transcends the social boundaries that had once seemed insurmountable. She passed 5 years ago, Ora says quietly. Cancer took her, but she lived to see her grandchildren grown, lived to see changes in the world that we could never have imagined when we were girls. In her last letter, she told me that she'd spent her whole life trying to listen to voices that others might dismiss, because she remembered what it felt like when nobody would listen to the voice that was trying to save her. The afternoon light slants across Ora's porch as she finishes her story, casting long shadows that seem to connect the present moment to all the moments that came before. I suppose what I want folks to understand, she says, looking directly into the camera with the steady gaze that has characterized her entire life, is that important truths don't always come from the people you expect to deliver them. Sometimes the most crucial information comes from the person standing at the edge of the conversation, the one who's been watching and listening while everyone else was talking. She holds up the faded photograph one more time, showing the two girls whose unlikely friendship had grown from a crisis that nearly claimed a life. This picture reminds me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and speaking up anyway, because you understand that some things are more important than your own comfort or safety. As the documentary crew prepares to pack up their equipment, Ora carefully places the photograph back in her memory box, alongside the pressed flower she'd saved from that first day of noticing Lucy's strange behavior and the small notebook, where she'd recorded her observations with such meticulous care. "You know," she says, settling back into her chair as the prairie wind stirs the leaves of the oak tree that shades her porch, "I never set out to be a hero or to change anybody's mind about anything. I just saw something that worried me and couldn't live with staying quiet about it." She looks out across the landscape where she has spent her entire life, seeing in its familiar contours the evidence of all the stories that have played out across its surface. But I've learned that sometimes that's exactly what heroism looks like. Just one person who notices something important and refuses to be silenced, even when silence would be easier. The camera captures her final words as the Oklahoma sun begins to set behind her, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seem to celebrate a story finally told in full. Every voice matters. Every observation counts. And sometimes, the person everyone overlooks turns out to be the one who sees everything most clearly. The faded photograph rests safe in its memory box, a testament to the truth that some friendships transcend every boundary, and that courage, once demonstrated, becomes a legacy that enriches every life it touches for generations to come.